Fantasy Animation Podcast takes its listeners on a journey through the colliding and sometimes competing worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each episode, we select an example of fantasy animation and consider the ways in which it functions to inspire and use our imaginations within the sphere of all things that are sculpted, composed, crafted and drawn. To help support the show, please subscribe via your podcast feed and give us a like and a quick review. It takes no more than a minute, but it really helps us to grow our audience. You can also find our archive of podcasts and our weekly blog at fantasy-animation.org. You'll find the latest reviews there, features, editorials, all written by academics, writers, historians and professional animators working within these overlapping media, mediums and genres. Failing all that, tell your friends, tell a friend about the show and the good work we do here. There's no substitution for good old-fashioned word of mouth, so thanks for downloading, and I really hope you enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome again to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I remain, as always, Alex Sargent.
And I continue to be Chris Holliday.
Yeah, continue to be, and as ever was. Chris, this week we are doing The Secret of Moonacre,
Yes.
I think, underappreciated fantasy film from the late noughties.
Yes.
A movie about time, a movie about family, a movie about conflict and trauma, the high fantasy, the low fantasy, somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. So I think there's loads for people to be interested in from my perspective this week. How about in terms of animation?
Well, I think it's, and you gestured to it, I think its 2008-ness is significant insofar as some of the other fantasy films around the period that perhaps leaned on certain kinds of digital special effects. I have, a couple of notes, I think, on the director, who obviously has a particularly important or significant animation heritage. And I would also say something, maybe I'll get a chance to ask this week's impossible question about woods, the role of woods and forests in both animation and fantasy films. And I know you've written a bit on the kind of the forest, the space of the forest. And I think there's something also to be said around the role of the forest in animation. So, a few little things, but a film I'd not really heard of, so excited to kind of delve into at the moment.
Absolutely, and we have a very special guest with us this week, so to help us crack the secret of Moonacre.
You are a genius.
Yeah. How many episodes have we done now? 90-something? Yeah. I'm finally getting it. We have the film's co-screenwriter and associate producer, as well as senior lecturer and colleague here at the University of Portsmouth in creative writing, Lucy Shuttleworth. Lucy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hello, hi.
This is a movie that I've heard you speak about kind of in faculty and departmental meetings and talks before. It's a movie that I know is a bit dear to your heart. So I wonder if you could start by telling the listeners, I guess, your story of how you came to the film. How did you become involved in the project and where did it start for you, at least?
Okay, well, it really started with the fact that The Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge was my favourite book as a kid. I was rather obsessed with it. And when I became head of development for a production company, I said, hey, we should make this into a film. And my bosses said, okay, see if you can find out the rights. So my assistant and I wrote various letters, emails, phone calls, nothing happened. And then we got an email out of the blue from two women in Australia who were not producers, hadn't made anything, but were also obsessed with the book and owned the rights. And then about 3 weeks later, they ended up at my house, sitting around my kitchen table, I said, listen, I've got money. I work for a company. I'm head of development, which is head of creative. Let's make this film. And I also mentioned that I wanted to write it. I'd already written another movie for them, so I was working, writing, and I was told, as long as it doesn't impact on your work, you can write it. And a friend of mine, Graham Alborough, who'd written quite a few, was working at the time, doing quite a lot of children's telly, said, hey, it's quite a big film, why don't you work on it with me? So he lived close, which was handy. And so a lot of time, the film was really constructed around my kitchen table. that's how The Secret of Moonacre began. It was an obsession for me. I just knew it would make an amazing film, and it was a passion. And I went to South Africa, I went to Los Angeles as my job as a development exec, but also meeting people, talking to people, saying, hey, what about this? And had a lot of interesting conversations with, hey, make him a guy. It's not Harry Potter. And it's like, yeah, no, it's based on a Victorian novel. That's not going to work.
I think they did a version of Harry Potter, didn't they, for the big screen, a series of films. So, market was cornered.
Yeah, and you're like, yeah, that's a really cool idea. I wish I'd thought of that.
Yeah.
But it's a Victorian novel. And then I sent it to the director, Oliver Parker, who at that point, cast director. Oliver Parker was quite a big director at the time.
Yeah.
And he loved the script. And then again, a lot of kitchen tables, how script development. Graham and I would be at his kitchen table or in Brighton working on the project, and he loved it. And we had various readings, and we had Colin Firth kind of almost attached, interested in it at one point to play Sir Benjamin. My bosses were like, Lucy's project, interesting. Colin Firth, Oliver Parker. I'll give you a little bit of money to do a reading with actors. Yeah. And suddenly all sorts of people were like, this is really interesting. And then Oliver had St Trinian's, which was a total production clash. And as is the way, directors always take on a variety of projects. They have to, because you never know what's going to happen, what's going to go into production. And he just felt he had to give his time to that. And he hoped that when St Trinian's, if it was still there, he'd love to step back. And we sent it to Gábor, who had just made The Bridge to Terabithia, which was a massive hit. And he absolutely loved it. He found it really moving, and then he was in Brighton. Again, people kept flying out there. So that, for me, the trajectory of getting it made had been a few years of real passion and kind of obsession, and doing lots of meetings with Ollie Parker, talking to different sorts of people, getting rejections, getting almosts. And then when Gábor came on board, it was like a bidding war, suddenly. All the distributors wanted it, and Warner Brothers came on board and then was like, OK, you're greenlit.
Wow.
And it was, wow, OK, this is happening. We had been looking with Ollie for a Maria for quite a long time, and we did casting competitions, and I went to Oxford with him, and we interviewed lots of girls. It's tough. Maria is central to every scene. It's a lot for a child actress. You feel that kind of responsibility. But Dakota had just done The Golden Compass.
Yeah, I was going to say, I couldn't remember which one came first. So she'd done The Golden Compass.
She'd done The Golden Compass,
okay.
So there was an obvious fit. And she was used to working on set and on a relatively big film. And Gábor really loved the script. He wasn't that interested in the book. He didn't have that whole kind of, it's an adapted a classic book, so he didn't really care. So it all looked very, it was all shot in Hungary. It was all kind of quite Eastern European. And because Warner Brothers came on board, and then Dakota, then the casting, Gillette Stevenson, I think, was wonderful. Film production is so much based on co-production, on where you can get what's, soft money, production money. Hungary was a fantastic place to shoot, with studios and money, and Gábor's obviously Hungarian. So
sure, it made sense.
So that made sense. Tim Curry was very, very funny, I have to say. Master of very, very rude asides. But yeah, I am proud of it. It was a big, emotional, kind of full-on thing that took a lot of time, because I really had been obsessively, had done a lot of the kind of creative producing and working on it, and worked on the post as well. But there was this sort of disconnect with all of the producers, which often happens, that made it quite difficult. And you're just like, let's just talk about the film. But Gábor is an absolute delight. Okay. Really interesting, creative person, obsessed with Frank Zappa.
So, right, okay. Another question to add to the list I've got to ask then. But that's a really great sort of distilled. There's lots I'd love to unpack on that. Perhaps if we can let's just go back to the beginning of the process, which is that you read this novel that you read as a child, did you?
Yeah.
And you fell in love with it.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, like, if for listeners who perhaps don't know the story or have seen the movie, but it's been a bit of a while. What could you just give us a sort of what it was about the novel that really captured you, and perhaps by that way we can introduce the sort of basic plot of this thing.
Okay.
And then also, when did you first start wanting to pitch it as a movie? Because I think that's important in terms of some of the time frames, in terms of who you cast, some of the directors. This is a very, in many ways, this fits very comfortably within the Hollywood's world of fantasy at this moment, but I'd love to hear where the process started and when things kind of started to get greenlit.
Oh, gosh.
We'll start with the novel, though. Tell us about that first.
Okay, well, the novel was a book that I read when I was a child and I kind of fell in love with, and it's a bit like, I guess it has Jane Austen qualities in terms of Austen's great ability to observe character and create certain archetypes, and as in the best children's book, poking fun at adults and their kind of massive egos and bad behaviour and difficulties, and this orphan, always great to have a character who's an orphan who doesn't have parents, to find and reunite this sort of warring family in the middle of the woods. I'm actually, I have to say, so I'm writing something else about the woods at the moment. I'd love to talk to you more about woods.
Woods.
It's all set in the woods. It's a Norwegian myth, but anyway, that's another story. It's a very powerful story, and she also had, I liked the issues that Elizabeth Goudge, in her own sort of Victorian way, looked at class. Mm-hmm. Robin was the boy who in London had been her invisible friend. Graham and I had so many headaches over trying to work out how do we create an invisible friend, with lots and lots of tea around my kitchen table, thinking how do we do this? But also, he was a local boy that in the end she kind of falls in love with. There's a mirror relationship between Loveday and Sir Benjamin of opposites attract, and obviously they're children, but you have this idea that maybe they will end up together when they're adult. But there are lots of themes around fairness, around morality, around not letting your ego destroy your life and start wars for no reason and destroy everybody in your own selfish quest to be right. And there's a lot of kind of observation, I guess, also around sort of, I guess, male ego and female ego, because Loveday certainly has an ego, but there is a lot of kind of bluster. I'm your father. I'm your uncle. I am king of the woods. Don't ever argue with me because I'm the boss type. She pokes fun at that. So I think it's a very layered novel, but also there's lots of beautiful imagery and magic. Yeah. English classic novel with fantasy elements, and also I actually teach writing for children and young adult literature, that there's something about hope. There is a great sense of hope. And also the kids getting the adults to stop behaving so badly and seeing that actually, you have to learn how to apologise and accept that you've been an idiot, and that pride is one of the worst sins of all, with huge amounts of drama and obviously animals, as we were talking earlier, a big dog.
Big dog.
So I was very into the whole idea of unicorns and horses, and there are all of those tropes in there that make it exciting. And, J.K. Rowling said, what was one of your main influences? And she said Little White Horse. So that was in itself. So I then was like, right, we've got to get hold of David Heyman, see if they want to co-produce with us. And sadly, they didn't. But that was also something that helped. I guess, I'm a pitcher. When I was pitching it, talking to people.
So was your decision to pitch, or to pitch this book that had been in your life for a long time, motivated at all by this sort of the fantasy? Try pitching this film in 1995 versus 2005, and it's a very different job, I imagine, because the stock fantasy had undergone. We'd had Harry Potter, we'd had Lord of the Rings, and we'd had the Narnia movies, right? So I wondered if you were aware of this might be a good time to get this project greenlit.
Probably. I mean, at that point, I wasn't working as head of development for a company, so that also helped. But it was a kind of an obsession, really. whether or not there'd been any other. I just thought this will make it's a fantastic story.
No, sure.
But of course it did help.
That's still more what I meant, really. Was it a better commercial climate to make this movie?
Yeah, although the Narnia movies didn't do perhaps as well, box office-wise, than everybody would have expected. But there was that. That definitely helped. But for me, it was just a kind of... I was in this position where I could write this film and work for a company that would helm it, which makes a lot of difference. And at that point, they were quite well placed as a well thought of production company with influence and money, etc. As I said, as long as it didn't impact on my work, which I made sure it didn't, then it was fine for me to develop it. So it was really my baby. I was a bit obsessed with it, has to be said.
So this kind of 2000s period then is, I think, as you're both sort of saying, I did a quick look up of fantasy films in 2007, and obviously 2008 is the first of the Marvel films, and it seems like there's a cluster of fantasy films, or this kind of fantasy film in 2007, 2008, before Hollywood becomes progressively dominated by a different kind of movie. And it's all, we always talk to students about the peaks and troughs of genres as they come in and out of fashion, and what that then says about the world out there. And so 2007, you have Golden Compass, which you obviously have mentioned, a film, and then another film that I've been trying to get Alex for us to do on the podcast, Stardust, because I really like Stardust. This has been a slow burner
Love
for
Stardust,
me. Getting Stardust.
He phrases that like I've pushed against this.
You vetoed it.
I hate it.
No, I like Stardust a lot. We've just not done it yet.
Bridge of Terabithia, which you've already mentioned, and then sort of a few others that I think would fit. Ratatouille, my favourite Pixar film. There's a lot going on in this period.
Yeah.
I'll also throw in, we've had like Pan's Labyrinth, which I know is not necessarily something you compare to something like that, but it brings a lot of prestige.
To fantasy,
I think Pan's Labyrinth, Bridge to Terabithia, Secret of Moonacre are an interesting trajectory to think through in terms of, in many ways, they're very similar movies, but perhaps with slightly different tones and registers. Because they're both about kind of the fantastical in history, the fantastical in memory, the relationship between fantasy and conflict, and as a process of sort of healing and trauma. And I've always thought,
that's interesting.
Maybe it's because I went to see Secret of Moonacre because I'd seen Bridge to Terabithia and I'd seen Pan's Labyrinth, and I'd been so kind of bowled over by this new, what I felt to be a new kind of quote unquote taking fantasy seriously, because the kind of fantasy that existed before that had either been the big Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings franchise, prestigious adaptations, or they're Dungeons and Dragons or Willow, or the slightly more kind of campy aesthetic. So I think it's an interesting moment in the history of the genre, and I think this movie really is an important example of this little moment as well. So I don't know, were you any of these influences bubbling around?
I think that's interesting for me, because I'm a bit obsessed with magic realism. I love magic realism, and I'm now thinking of, I went to see a screenwriting, I went to a talk about Pan's Labyrinth and with the writer-director, and he was so brilliant, extraordinary, and he said that it came from a dream when he was, and that really affected me. I mean, I love all of that kind of storytelling. He said that when he was a kid in Mexico, he stayed with his grandmother, and he was always scared of this great big wardrobe, and his grandmother would say, it's nothing to be frightened of, and she'd come in the night and she'd open the wardrobe and there was nothing there, and she said, you've got to do that one day on your own without me here, and you will see there is nothing there. And so one night, and he set the scene beautifully, and there was the moonlight, and his brother was asleep, and he woke slowly, and he opened this great big wooden, you can imagine this ancient wardrobe, and he opened it, and there was a horned creature who is the drawing of Pan's Labyrinth. And that's how the story came. And he said he showed us all of his notebooks, so he draws everything. And that was before. I think I went to meet him and talk to him was before. Maybe I was writing Moonacre, but that always really influenced me. I love the idea of children and fear and fantasy and whether it's real or not. He's interesting because he draws everything. But of course, that character with the horns is actually quite benign in Pan's Labyrinth.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess what your movie has in common with these examples is that there is this in each of the three, so I'm talking about Pan's Labyrinth, Bridge to Terabithia, The Secret of Moonacre, there seems to be in the first
There's
act
a connectivity,
and there's this attempt to kind of at first fantasy and reality are presented as separate things. So in your film, you've got the kind of story of the orphan, but then she reads the book, right, and you get this much more kind of mythical tale. And then as the film develops, you realise that the two worlds are actually one world,
They're
and
actually
perhaps
one
two
world,
different ways
yes.
of looking at the same world, which is exactly what the sort of other two movies also kind of try to explore.
Absolutely, yes. And there is this fantasy element, and the fact that Robin has been, we didn't do that in the film, we had to simplify it, but the fact that Robin has been in London, but he's also in Moonacre.
Yeah.
And also those themes of forests, very, very strong, the idea of, going into the woods and the bad people that live in the woods, and what the woods mean, but also it's where the little white horse is, which is a symbol of everything pure and good and beautiful. So it's interesting. But I think that's probably true. And for Gábor, at that point, when we talked about it, he said he'd been offered, at that point he was being offered everything.
Yeah.
He was reading everything. He was offered everything because he'd had this smash hit, and he just fell in love with the story because of the themes and the magic and how different. Pan's Labyrinth is obviously much darker.
So I have three, I guess off of the back of that. One, I'm going to throw in Tarsem Singh's 2006 film, The Fall.
Yeah, another similar kind of movie.
Which, in terms of storytelling, and it seems like, a lot of, from what the fantasy films that we've done, a lot are very reflexive about imagination and storytelling and the way that this film uses the split between two potential worlds that would ultimately then kind of come together, and how printed images become moving images and then vice versa at the end of the film. So I kind of like how that plays out formally, the bridging of kind of two worlds. So the director who we could spend, we haven't got time to go through the director, but if you go and look at his biography, the stuff that he's done, the programs that he's worked on, working at Hanna-Barbera, Scooby-Doo, Nick Riviera, the character from The Simpsons, just little things like the biography of Super is kind of fascinating, really, and seems. I hadn't made the connection with Terabithia in this film because I don't think I've seen Terabithia, which is we'll add that to the list.
Yeah,
we'll do Stardust and then we'll do kind of Terabithia. But I suppose I had a question informed by the climate in which this film is entering into, the role of fantasy after 9/11, let's say, and scholars are writing about the importance of catharsis in relation to fantasy, almost going back to this would make a good film, because students often use this word. The thing is very cinematic. They use the word cinematic, which film studies never really talks about. We don't really know what the cinematic is. It's never really defined, but it's a thing where video games are really cinematic, and it's often used as a way to describe. So I just want, when you're reading this book that you think has a kind of purchase in this period, what is, when we say it would make a really good film, or it would make this sequence is particularly cinematic. What's that like? What does that like? Are you visualising this is how it's going to work? Because the idea of the cinematic.
Yeah. It's interesting, when I'm teaching screenwriting, that's the word I use. The other words I use is filmic. What does that mean?
There used to be a kind of thing of film studies cliches, and it was the film is a meditation on something. No one ever says that. Filmic has got a good one. Students always said the dynamics of a scene. What do you mean the dynamics of the scene? So cinematic. Yeah. And I think we kind of know what it means without really knowing what it means. So I'd be interested in your take on it. My trajectory
as a writer is that I was a script reader. I was saying, this is great, buy this, make this. And I became a script editor because actually one of the producers of Usual Suspects said, I really like the way you write. Can you come and start reading scripts for me and developing ideas with writers? So that's how I ended up working for a production company as head of development, because I'd worked for years reading scripts as a freelance editor, working with other writers. And what is it? How do we make it filmic? How do we make it cinematic? How do we make it so it makes us want to weep? And how do we use the beauty of landscape, of objects, of place to inform the story that makes us see why the character is heartbroken, whatever it is. So it's that, I guess. It's a good answer.
Yeah. So how do you do that in terms of turning this book into a script then? Perhaps this is a really ridiculous assumption, but the problem with a script is that quite often the plot, the direction has to be communicated through character, if you're handling it, or
Sure.
it needs to be kind of a footnote for the director to deal with later. And my understanding is industry standard tends to be keep the stage directions to a minimal and
Absolutely.
focus
There's
on
a-
character and dialogue.
Yeah.
So how do you make character and dialogue magical, I guess is my question.
Okay, all right. Well, it's a lot more than that because you're writing your visual storytelling. So a lot of the way I teach is around visual storytelling.
Right.
So what I would go back to, I'm just going to drop in the name of a master here. Martin Scorsese
Sure.
says
Heard of him.
that everything, whatever genre you're working in, you're writing a fantasy, you're writing a drama, you're writing a thriller, everything is about character. Everything is about, and then once you have your character, then you create the plot. Fantasy is world building, but it's all about creating authentic emotional storytelling. So fantasy is building a world like any other world. So you could be building 1940s Paris. You could be setting your story then, or you could be setting it in a world where you're in the Spanish Civil War and there are kind of strange creatures who live in the woods. It doesn't really make any difference. It's how you set up. Once you create, for me, everything is about character. And I'm writing a myth at the moment with a whole kind of lot of fantasy, but it's independent art house for a Norwegian company. But for me, it's all about the characters. So I do all my research in terms of myth and fantasy, and I need to know what I would call the visual grammar of that and what that fantasy is and how that world works. But once you have the characters, everything else will fit into place, I would say. So I think it's just about building that world and knowing what the law is. So what's the world? How does this world function? How do these people live? What are they allowed to do? You know, it's the same. I managed a whole horror slate. You know, what can these vampires do?
Sure.
You know, is it crosses and garlic? Is it this and that? If it's not, set it up really early so we know then we can relax. And you can't really create depth in a story with fantasy or horror, which I think, or sci-fi, until you know what that visual grammar of the world. And once you can do that, then you can add the complexity, because the complexity always comes from characters. And I would say dialogue is the last thing you think about when you're writing a screenplay. It's all about the visual. It's all about showing, not telling us who the people are, showing the world they live in, showing, you know, everything. I always think you show, and then the dialogue comes second.
So talk us through that in terms of this movie then. Like how does you've got the book, you've
got
got
the
your
book.
coffee table, right, what do we do first then?
Okay, so what you do is then you kind of, for me, I'd been schooled in writing synopses. I read all these dark materials for the then Film Council in 4 days, I think, nearly had to read every book and then write a synopsis. So in my training, that's my training to be a screenwriter. It's like, what is this story? Let's distill it.
Sure.
What are the main beats? I went to a talk the other day for writers with Aaron Sorkin, which was really interesting. He's over in London, and he said, as a journalist, you have to say, this is the timeline. As a writer, as a screenwriter, we have to create the organic truth of the story of the film, which is separate. I thought it was really interesting. I've been chatting to my students about this. Sorry, what was the direct question?
So the question is, you know, so you've got the book. How
So
do you
you've got
do
the book.
that
So
in
you
practice?
compress it all. You work it out. You write a synopsis.
Yeah.
You just go, okay, this is what happened. This is London. This is Miss Heliotrope. This is Robin. It's a breakdown of what the story is, and then it's working out how to compress it. So before we got Ollie Parker on board, we'd spent a lot of time. It was really difficult. I mean, the imaginary friend thing took a long time to kind of work out how the hell we were going to do that and how that would make sense. And then it was so much easier when we thought, no, she just meets him here. You know, we're not going to have him in London. But again, it's that organic truth of the story. And when you're adapting a novel, the film has to take on its own trajectory. What are the big beats of this story? It's about love, it's about hope, it's about family, it's about redemption, thematically, the woods, pride, etc., etc. So you're breaking all of that down, but you're looking at what are the big beats and what are the beats you're going to introduce. Stephen King will say this, you know, shrinking, writing, cutting. So it was still it was huge. Graham and I would fight about, I think it was 130 pages or something, far too long, 140 pages, cutting it back. What is the essence of the story? What do we need to say at this point? How does it relate to the emotional state of the characters? So you're always just slicing it off. And then when Gábor came on board, every director has their own, this is me, and Oliver Parker and Gábor obviously very different. So there were quite a few elements to do with the curse and the plotting that were different. So there was quite a lot of changing, massaging, working out on the script. And then the money comes in and they're like, cost. So how do we cut this back? When you make a movie, when you're as a writer, you're lucky if they shoot every scene. So we kind of came in and did some rewrites and things to kind of make it all make sense. Yeah.
Well, I think the outcome is that it seems I was struck by how very economical it is in terms of there's no fat on the film at all, really. And it seems like the outcome of some of those editorial processes, the outcome of those processes is the role of Maria, because you talked about the casting of Dakota Blue Richards, and obviously off of the back of The Golden Compass, but she's in pretty much every scene.
She's in every scene, yeah. And there are a lot of rules, as there should be. They have to have school time.
Yeah.
And they can't. So that also, that affected. But also, we had a lot of action in the woods with the Code Noir.
Yeah.
And actually, one of my students told me that Secret of Moonacre is massive on TikTok. Who knew? People love Robin. Lots of girls love Robin.
Right.
And there are lots of scenes that are played. There are scenes from Moonacre on TikTok. It was quite exciting to hear that.
There you go. I've got a very strong kind of adamant whiff from Robin. I think the kind of focalising.
Gábor like Clockwork Orange as well.
Right. I can see that.
Yeah.
But no, it seems that the outcome of some of these editorial decisions is a very streamlined film that is told very much through Maria's.
From her,
not point of view, but I would say kind of more focalized.
Yeah.
And that is through the beginning and ending, bookending by the book, her role as narrator, her role as sort of creative agent, the kind of symbolic of her taking the hands of Tim Curry and Ioan Gruffudd, putting them together, and kind of just wanting to get things done. There's something. It seems like that was a really positive outcome of this stripping back and cutting and editing, and because it really allowed her story to really be centralized, and that gave it a sort of, it reminded me actually of something like Enola Holmes, which is very similar in terms of what it does with class. There's a kind of Robin-esque character in it. It's played a lot more reflexively, I think, in terms of the looks to cameras, but it struck me as very similar in terms of how it was using a sort of 13, 14, 15-year-old girl to kind of see the world through her eyes. And so I really liked that about the film. So I just wondered, that seems to be really a great thing in terms of what you were doing and editing and stripping back.
Well, I think it's pivotal. The book is about Maria's journey, but it's also about this, it starts off in a classic way of this girl who's very lonely, whose mum died when she was a baby, whose dad has not been around, has always at, gambling or at parties, or, she has this governess who she loved, Juliet Stevenson was fantastic in it. But yes, it is very much, everything is about her and her experience and her falling in love with Rolf, the dog, lion. That's one of my favourite scenes when Rolf walks past the mirror and turns into a lion. Yes, sorry, was there any other questions?
I think that the streamlining is it felt very... I think what I'm getting at is that it felt very character-centred, which makes perfect sense given what you were talking about. For a genre, maybe this is not necessarily true, I'm looking at Alex here, but for a genre that maybe often gets critiqued, like many genres, in terms of style over substance, and a time when we're after 2005, 2006, where we've had 10 years of a lot of digital stuff happening in Hollywood, a bit longer if we go digital did exist before Toy Story. I appreciate that, but there was a lot happening, and I've talked previously on the podcast about 2005, 2006 being a saturation point. I remember Variety running a series of pieces around Hollywood's now becoming saturated by the digital, and also at a time when Pixar had made Cars and it didn't do particularly well, and there was a sort of, what's happening now with the digital? Where are we going to go with this? And there was certainly an industry perspective that there might have been a saturation.
I have to say, when I was in LA originally trying to raise money and having meetings about the project, I met with one of the sort of script creative developers of Toy Story who worked with Pixar, and she was amazing, and the notes she gave me on the script were the best I've ever had, and she talked a lot about Toy Story and how they developed it, and gave some really, really interesting, powerful notes, also about kids and thinking about the market and how you convey stories, and it was really, really useful. That then I went back and discussed that with the producers and with Graham, and I think that really, really helped elevate it. Screenwriting is development. It's always the reason. The scripts are never usually shot on one draft. It's a lot. It takes a long while. And a book like this which was big. It was a big story to try and condense it and make it exciting and relevant and not overcomplicated.
Well, that's the thing. I think it felt very grounded in a way that I would imagine critiques of, and I think that's why I also like Stardust, which we'll definitely be doing in the future. But there's something very character centered around these films and the role of visual effects and digital visual effects, of which there are plenty, but it didn't seem overwhelming. There were chosen in particular ways to nuance the action in kind of true magical realist style, to kind of nuance the real rather than overwhelm it. And for a genre, and I don't know whether this is true, but it feels like fantasy would open itself up or invite critiques of its, well, it's just all, there's too much spectacle and not enough narrative, as if spectacle couldn't mean anything, which is wrong, but also the genre privileges one over the other. And this felt it felt a slightly different way of doing fantasy.
Well, there's so much snobbish. I mean, people are very, well, that's this, or you can't do that, or that's a superhero film, therefore it's not good, or it's got too many special effects, or how do you tell stories? It's great special effects don't need to be huge. In fact, the film that I'm in the process of writing, it's sleight of hand, but hopefully, and has got that almost Eastern European influence. Hopefully that the sense of fantasy can be as powerful without masses and masses of special effects.
Yeah. One of the legacies of not so much Harry Potter, but the Lord of the Rings movies, right, is that the Lord of the Rings movies essentially, I mean, they take what's in the books already, in that there is massive wars and things like that in the books, but actually, they're almost constructing them. Jackson turns them into kind of basically historical epics with action beats, and that kind of it makes it into a grammar of action cinema. And I remember when you mentioned the Narnia films. Now, I don't know exact timeline. I suspect Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe had come out when this was in development. I'm not sure about the other two, which were a lot less successful, but I remember that film was quite commercially successful, Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, but it critically kind of was muted. And one of the things it got criticised for was basically this is Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe a la Middle-earth, in that what they'd basically done to the film, and I can remember, is they'd added these sort of action set pieces that aren't in the original. There is a kind of allusion to a battle towards the end of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but it doesn't take place in Middle-earth between six mountains and all these sort of lions leaping at orc-like figures and all the, basically they created another...
Too much action,
So I think your film, it's interesting that you've alluded to the fact that actually what perhaps was cut as the production went along was some action, more action-orientated set pieces.
Nothing like that. Nothing
not
comparison.
Was that always organically put in because the book
It's part of the book. It's a part of the story.
So tell us about those elements.
I mean, I think it's really important in any story, if you're telling a story, any story, there has to be conflict. Where does that conflict come from? There has to be an antagonist, whether it's a person or a place or a company, or there has to be something. That's the drama. So there has to be, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And so their story is often more interesting, funnier. They have the best lines, inevitably. So to take too much of them out, I felt, was a loss to what the film could have been.
What was in there then? Because I haven't read the book, so obviously all I got was Tim Curry, which I always could do with more of Tim Curry in largely everything.
Just it was much more. It just took a longer period of time, and I mean, I'd have to reread our scripts to have a look to see specifically, but it would have added more it just adds more suspense. So by the time the third act happens, you're really like, it's never going to work. It's all going to go horribly wrong because this guy's never going to come to the table. He's not going to come to the party because, he has too much to lose.
Yeah.
And then it just makes it that much more emotionally resonant, I would say.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I know Lord of the Rings. This guy, one of the original producers, said it was about this passion, this kind of suddenly seeing it. Often it's, you get the right executive to say yes at the right time. My experience, then things happen. They can see it.
And that's when you gave me your answer about the, dialogue is about character and, it doesn't matter if you're telling a story that's in horror or it's all about, and I completely agree with, and I think as a screenwriter, it's important to think like that. And I think because that's what the screenwriter's job is to invest a sense of authenticity and presence to characters that are essentially words on a page, right?
Yeah.
But there is a tension between that and, if you're going to call something a fantasy movie and if you're going to accept that people know what that is, people don't pay to see fantasy movies because they're just like all movies. They pay them because there's something quintessentially fantastical about it.
Yeah,
so there is a certain element of, I want to see my unicorns, please, on screen. So I think the way the film... and I guess how that translates in terms of your production process, I imagine, is that quite early on in the process, particularly the way VFX tends to work, is there's someone's going to be asking you, all right, what's the stuff we need to start developing here? What's the lions that we need to start making on
Okay,
screen?
well, what happens is, when it looks like this movie's actually going to get made, we're going to get green-lit, then you have your budget.
And was this when Ollie Parker was still on board, or was this...
I imagine there would be some provision. No, there might have been some provisional. They would have been looking, the whole time you're always looking, because anyone's going to get involved, they say, what's the budget? What's the napkin budget? So
it affects how you write it, I would have thought, a little bit, does it? As much as I'm sure you don't want it to.
Yeah, I mean, there were obviously, there were some special effects that I can't even think of now, which we didn't include. But you're working towards a certain level budget. Mm-hmm. But then there is a special effects budget. But if you have a director who comes on board who's just shot a movie that's very, very successful and you have Warner Brothers behind you, makes it a whole lot easier in terms of what the budget is and how much they're prepared to spend on it. But for me, everything's about creating an authentic story. And then after that, if you say, at the moment, I don't have a huge amount for S. I'm not saying, right, I'm going to do this. So I'm thinking creatively of what I could do. If they said to me, hey, Lucy, budget, you don't need to worry about it, I'd be maybe doing some slightly different things.
I guess the question actually, I'm more interested on a creative level because, I remember Philippa Boynes tells a story of Lord of the Rings where basically it's a very gendered story, and I'd like to think it didn't actually work out this way, but certainly the way she told it was that it got to a certain point in the screenwriting when they were kind of rewriting as the films were being made, where they just realised that anything that involved two people standing in a room talking to each other, her and Fran would deal with. At any moment an orc hit anyone with a different weapon, they just said that Peter will sort that out afterwards. So they wouldn't write anything in the script. They would just put they fight, and that would turn into 10 minutes of choreographed action. I wonder, you must be in an odd position in a screenwriter in that
it's very annoying that.
Yeah.
Someone asked me, quite a well-known actor,
right,
asked me if I had actually properly co-written The Secret of Moonacre. Because I was a woman, and could I possibly have written action?
You must have done the costumes, right?
Yeah, you must have done the costumes. Yeah. Did you just do the exactly?
Or the bits where where she talks to the cook. That's probably your thing, isn't it? Right, where she's running around in a wood fighting things. Yeah,
exactly.
But how do you? What do you give the visual effects team to work with? Let's take the story right at the beginning of the myth and the magical pearls and all that sort of stuff. What do you want to put in your script so that you're having an influence over how these pearls are going to look on a screen, how these things are going to, you don't write such and such grabs pearls. You write something to give them.
The thing is, I was mentored. Not writing, actually after I'd written Moonacre by Bill Nicholson, who wrote Gladiator, probably being his most famous film. And he always bang his hand on, screenwriter does everything.
Okay,
they're
good.
bloody directors. They come in here, write everything. We write everything, and we do. We write everything. Write it how you see it. Write it how you want it to be shot. But you can't put in shot direction. So for me, I write everything.
Okay.
And people often say, you write like a director. I mean, I write...
Or they direct like a screenwriter.
Or they direct like a screenwriter, yeah. So it's, everything is about you putting in, for us, for Graham and I, we everything was pretty detailed in terms of how it wasn't like that, but it obviously wasn't Lord of the Rings with 10,000 million orcs.
No,
too many orcs. There's too many blades flashing.
There's too many orcs.
Certainly, that by the time your film came along,
that.
people were starting to come round to that way of thinking. Is that not every fantasy movie has to have a 20-minute orc fight in it?
Exactly, 20 minutes. We didn't have the time. Depends how much. I mean, if you have the budget of the Lord of the Rings, Bill Nicholson would say, Gladiator, it's just about emotion. It's about a guy who wants to get back to his family. That's all it's about. And everything else that's how he kind of rewrote it as it was being shot. And that's always, when I'm working, it's always about character. And it doesn't, I mean, I rewrote an action film COVID makes you forget all time. Was it last year or the year before?
Pass.
Year before, an action movie, which was great fun. I hadn't written an action movie since Moonacre. It's fantastic. It's great fun. And, you write it. You have to be able to see it. You've got to be there. You've got to close your eyes. You need to do your research. Whatever it is, whatever fight scene you're doing, you need to be in the room.
Yeah.
You need to see it, yeah. So that's my answer.
Good. It's a good answer.
I'd like to, I was going to say, I'd like to kind of talk a bit about location, because I think one of the things that, again, maybe this is part of the way in which the film felt grounded was its use of location and reading up on the film and from what you've said about where it was filmed and especially the sort of decrepit house that is very bare but gave it a sense of earthiness and grandeur, which kind of maps onto its use of effects. This isn't a saturated film where everything feels like it's in or done against a blue or green screen. It felt very on location, and I wondered, maybe this is the point to start talking about forests and woods and things like this, because certainly from an animation perspective, a lot of stuff that's written about forests and wooded spaces are conversely about technology. Woods are often the place where technological expressivity and experimentation takes place, whether it's Disney playing with the multiplane camera in the 1930s to give the Snow White woods that sense of depth and dimension. Fast forward to Tarzan, where it's using kind of deep canvas technology to create these incredible point of view sequences as Tarzan swoops through this three-dimensional luscious wooded area. So you have this weird paradox between technology and the organic. What's strange about animated wooded space, that the natural spaces in animation are often highly technological, and this maybe extends to some of the way that blue screening and green screen works. But Alex, I know that you've written on the prominence, we were at the same conference in fact, on woods and forests and kind of on why forests, I think in your case, why are forests such a repeating feature of fantasy movies? Lots of stuff in Harry Potter are in the woods and all this. And I don't know, why are the woods?
There's even
and
a
the
unicorn
forest?
in the woods, which J.K. Rowling said is the influence.
Well, I was thinking Patronus. I was thinking Patronus when I saw the white.
And Patronus.
Yeah, I also when I saw the horses in the sea, I also thought Guinness advert, but that's really a separate.
That is a separate thing.
That's a separate conversation. That's for our podcast episode on.
They'd obviously read The Little White Horse.
Exactly.
You see, they got Elizabeth Goudge was before the Guinness advert.
It's everywhere.
She was there earlier.
Why are woods and forests and it crops up a lot in fantasy films?
Well, it's a classical trope, isn't it? Gawain and the Green Knight, medieval literature. It's the woods. Keep to the path. Stick to the path.
Fairy tales
stick
are all
every
set in
fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel. Stick to the path. The Course of True Love, In the Woods. John Yorke's screenwriting book, which is brilliant. I use that quite a lot to teach. Into the Woods.
Yeah.
Into the Woods. What happens if you lose your path? There is great beauty, but there's also great terror. I've just been writing, a lot about the woods, about my project at the moment, but it's very exciting. Is woods and what they mean and the beauty of them and the idea of the sun being kept and the light that spills in, but the darkness of how they can be places of great joy and beauty, but they can also, if you get lost in the woods and you don't get out, every kind of Scandi noir, girls running through, being chased by monsters, whether they're human or fantasy. It's a very powerful backdrop to write in the woods.
I think it's, I could offer loads of kind of quasi-Freudian, which lots of people like to do, about woods as wombs and woods as, phallic symbols.
I'll stick it in the suggested reading.
In which case people can read that and be thoroughly bored by all that. The thing I would say is that I think it's Marina Warner who, when she talks about fairy tales, says that the etymology of fairy is quite confused. No
From
one
the
quite
Beast to
knows
the
where it
Blonde.
comes from. Yeah, from the Beast to the Blonde. But
Yeah.
she mentions two key words, and I'm probably going to forget the exact ones now. There's two kind of Anglo-Saxon words, and one of them's Faltum and one of them's Fagin or something like that. And basically, the two words that seem to crop up in fairy are fate and something about agreeable or to come to terms with or something like that. So in a way, you can see a fairy tale as an attempt to reconcile or come to terms with fate. There's stories where magic is used as a solution to...
Yeah, Midsummer Night's Dream, the other one, obviously.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
It's
Deep
interesting,
nature.
Liminal space. I've just given a big on the MA. We've spent the last 2 hours discussing liminal space and its importance, or the breadth in cinema.
Which is surely
in
where all
storytelling.
drama happens, right? In
Yeah.
liminality.
Liminal space. It's very interesting. Very, very powerful. I think. Well, the woods are. And from a simplistic point of view, there's not like, we can look out the window and we can see the road, and that's the road. You go into the woods and everything's game. What's going to happen? Adds jeopardy. It's exciting. And the woods at night. Any child is going to be scared.
There's also a thing in your film about nature, and is there a line? If I've got this wrong, I apologise. It's something like the Moon Queen says something like the pearls belong to no man, they belong to nature. And there's something in the movie about
Yes.
gender and nature and
genders.
femininity and
We did.
and the moon.
It's about the moon. I mean, the thing I kind of still felt a little bit sad, I think it would be more pronounced, is when Maria arrives at Moonacre, everything is lit by moonlight.
Oh, wow.
And there is extraordinary beauty.
Yeah.
She's come from London, and there is the sort of urban versus the countryside. And I think, yes, we decided to, a little insight here.
Love it.
We decided to link nature as something that audiences would recognise, that children who, the environmental story was was beginning to be felt by children and kids at school. And so it felt important. This is what we can do. We can talk about nature.
Are the gender themes as prominent in the book?
So I have to reread it and find
Isn't
out.
one of my favourite line is something like, no, I'm going to get it wrong to the screenwriter, but anyway, something like,
Let's all say lines in the movie we liked.
Let's all ruin the dialogue. Because it was about, I wish I'd written it down, but it's quiet. That's because the women aren't here. And so I don't really know what to say about the way that the film uses and plays with gender beyond some of the stuff you were saying earlier around kind of male and female egos. Tim Curry playing a very familiar to me Tim Curry style role, and also when Maria removes her dress.
Yes.
The dress, and then uses it as a distraction. Little moments in the film where the narrative is peppered with these.
Well, obviously, we wanted to make it relevant, and we wanted to create a story for girls that wasn't deeply gendered, and in terms of girls having action and not being passive characters. I mean, I really did have some unbelievable conversations when I was in Hollywood about this story, and about
needs more men in it.
Why can't it be about a boy?
Why can't it be about? It needs to be about a boy, because films about girls don't sell.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We had a conversation with Ron Clements and John Musker, the Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and we were talking about Treasure Planet, and they had the exact opposite note in their story, because theirs was about a teenage boy. This was when's Treasure Planet? 2000?
No, it's 2000.
2001, 2002, something like that. Yeah. But I think it's because it's the Disney stable, and we need princesses. We need to sell a princess. Yeah. And you've given us a teenage grumpy boy, and they were the exact opposite kind of problem. But that's the only time I've heard it be that way round. And I also imagine that if this film had come out in 2018. Hopefully less
it would
of
be
that.
a very different story.
But that's an interesting...
Very, very different story. I mean, I did some research for Portsmouth a few years ago looking at gender, and I went to LA and I went to New York, and I met with Gina Davis, who has done a massive around gender and animation, and she had her daughter quite late and was just so shocked at female characters in animations who didn't do anything. Sat there while the boys play on the swings, and it's a bit dangerous. So all of that was going on, but certainly people wouldn't have said the things they said to me now. They wouldn't be, they'd lose their jobs, they'd be frightened. It's a very different world out there, but also because now audiences want to see films with great roles for female characters. So and it makes money. So ultimately, that always makes a difference.
Well, another film that I'd like to do at some point on the podcast is Tangled, and again, a similar sort of film gets released or gets announced in 2008, around this sort of time as Rapunzel Unbraided, and then gets rebadged as Tangled to address a particular kind of male demographic. The trailers, and people have written about the way that the trailer plays with the role of Flynn Rider, the kind of, at that point, quote unquote, protagonist, certainly the protagonist of the trailer, not the protagonist of the film, and how Disney is trying to negotiate particular kinds of audiences. And it seems like this again is an overhang of Harry Potter. Tangled comes out at the tail end of the last Harry Potter films, as opposed to the novels. But the gender politics of fantasy and who's permitted to be a protagonist and who's not permitted, who's forbidden from being a protagonist is sort of it's interesting, but it seems to be particularly interesting in the case of fantasy, where journey narratives are particularly prominent.
Well, that's and it's a kind of classic quest movie. You know, if you look at Christopher Brooker, 7 Basic Stories. What is this plot? How can we? And we all know that we're working within a certain. There aren't how many new stories. What is this story, and how? And for me as a writer, it cuts down. And once I have an idea, okay, what is this movie? What are the general tropes? What is the story that I'm? Where are we going? But how can we make it resonant and exciting for audiences? And why the producer's going to be happy? And why how we're going to get great actors to be in it?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
I have one final question about, and this is the chance for me to get my obligatory Wizard of Oz reference in. So
I know
within the Hollywood context,
look at his eyes light up. I know what he's going to say about doubling.
Yeah, it's annoying that you knew what I was going to say.
Yeah.
The doubling of casting and how you have characters. One of the ways in which films communicates this kind of trauma that goes down the ages is to have different characters played by the same people.
Yes.
So I wondered at what point was that just an obvious thing from the start?
With Natasha.
With Natasha and also
Yowen,
playing Sir Ben, but also playing kind of
and
Tim Curry to an extent.
Yeah. So there is also, as you say, that
was that just an obvious thing?
That
from the
seemed
start?
an obvious thing, and obviously a hell of a lot cheaper than having to get other actors in. And
this is before digital de-aging and all this sort of business. The idea of kind of genealogies. Then I hadn't really thought about that. That fantasy often plays with legacy and myth and genealogy, and of course, in this case, it does it through by having actors play past and present, not the same character, but parts of a family. It sort of plays with the role of the.
It's also about that. The whole point of the gag of The Wizard of Oz and you were there and you were there and you there is that it asks the audience a question at the end about where the difference between Kansas and Oz actually lies.
It's that idea, isn't it, that if only you keep your eyes open, you can see, which is
magic
the same,
everywhere.
With the whole thing about the Wizard of Oz is if you realised, if you knew, if you had an open heart, then you could see that it's here.
Oz is everywhere.
Oz is everywhere, and the same, I guess, with Little White Horse and a lot of fantasies. Yeah, it's you just need to look clearly, and certainly the film I'm writing at the moment has some of that. Of it's everywhere if you just look in the right places. You want to, it's always a question of trying to make it as simple as possible. And I would say J.K. Rowling does that brilliantly in Harry Potter books. It's actually quite simple. But then you add the complexity on. Just how do you get from A to B? This is what you want. And then you add the complexity of what seems like complicated plot points later.
I've got, I quite like, I think in terms of the VFX, they seem to be quite concentrated at the end, which makes sort of perfect sense, or at least less visible or less veiled. A few little flourishes here and there at the beginning, with kind of the use of kind of shooting stars. I noted the detailing on the ceiling.
Well, you wanted the threat that the world is going to, the world is going to end, that everything, you've got to, it's really now or never. It has to be done, and you want that always, in story terms, a ticking clock.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? So this is where the money comes in.
I like that kind of the visual effects are narrativized because they appear in these sporadic, threatening instances that don't.
But then they build.
The
because they are actually going to destroy the world, and it is about the nature and the environment and everything else. I
don't know. Again, maybe I'm just obsessed with The Wizard of Oz, which I am. So that's answer my own question.
Maybe.
But there's lots of the colour is a really interesting use in the film. It feels like. Okay, you've nodded and said yes like that. It almost feels like every shot in this movie, when maybe it doesn't look magical, but there's something about the colour that brings it a kind of magical, realist aesthetic.
I think Gábor came from that animation, almost kind of puppetry, otherworldly background. that he maybe was interested in. I mean, he obviously chose the cinematographer very carefully. That was the palette that he wanted to use. If we shot it with Oliver Park, it would have been very English. It would have been a very different kind of film.
Yeah, interesting. I think we're probably running out of time here, Chris.
Yeah, I'm now looking up. There's a cluster of films again around that time where I think, and I don't know whether this is necessarily true, but my sense of it is a particular kind of fantasy film progressively being replaced, as I said earlier, with a certain kind of superhero movie, and it seems like the end of the first decade of the 2000s was caught between the end of Lord of the Rings and the beginning of Marvel, a group of films that were, as you said, were kind of playing with fantasy and being reflexive around fantasy and imagination and visual storytelling and that sort of stuff.
Where the Wild Things Are is probably the end of this cycle I've made up in my head. But I remember that coming out and it being doing very badly commercially, not critically, but commercially, and that's sort of, and then the success of Marvel kind of put an end to all that. But there was a real nice period there. Where
I think there's a place for both.
Yeah, of course there is.
The film I'm writing at the moment, I would say, has that. Definitely, I'm very influenced. I'd say by Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah. Well, he's kind of flying the flag for this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and I actually worked with the writers who wrote his first film. I don't know if you've seen.
Oh, The Devil's Backbone.
Yeah. So the writers of that I worked with as a script editor for hire, and they were very interesting. Anyway, that's another story. But I love that film.
And you're working on another fantasy production in some description now.
Writing, yeah. So it's, how am I pitching it? It's a myth based on a mythological Norse creature.
Okay.
In a real setting.
I want to ask follow-up questions, but I won't because I know.
Well, it's early development. I've written one draft. So we're in the early stages of development, but I absolutely love it.
Okay,
I'm very, very excited.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah.
Norse mythology in real world,
and it's kind of got. I've been writing a lot of comedy recently. It's darkly comic.
Okay, and just before we go, is there anything that you've made that other than Secret of Moonacre that people might want to check out and see online anywhere or?
Yes. Well, we're in post-production on a dance experimental film called Ultra, which is funded by the Arts Council, which I've been working with dancers, different artists who are looking at the way we all experience colour and how we react to it from an emotional sense, and how people with Alzheimer's see colour and how it affects their mood.
Interesting.
So we have 7 dancers who've danced, and it's a kind of narrative around colour. We hope to release the film with a kind of interactive arts exhibition in November. So we have a trailer, but it's an exciting project. But it is all about colour, and so my role has been as executive producer, but kind of creative, the film person, looking at how working big on set when it was shot, and looking at colour, and also how we create a narrative in a dance film.
Okay. And the film is called
Ultra,
and it'll be out from November. So if people are listening after that, do check it out and remember if not so.
Brilliant.
Well, we'll look forward to whatever that is when it comes out. But for now, Lucy, thanks so much for coming.
You're
on the
welcome.
show.
Thank you. It's fun.
It was really fun to talk about Secret of Moonacre with you, and it's a great movie. People should go and check it out because it's a really important part of the narrative of the last sort of 20 years of fantasy filmmaking.
Yeah.
I guess that's been us for another show. As always, you can follow us at Fananim Research on our various social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also use that to email us, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com if you have any questions on what we've just spoken about. We can do it as a footnote episode, answer any of your questions and deal with any comments or queries you might have on this film or any other that we've mentioned in the last few episodes. So do get in touch via that. And you can also find us on the website fantasy-animation.org. This episode has been sound engineered by Leon Waldo. And that's been us for an episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.